Hello and welcome back to Something Z, and welcome to What If Deku Was a Saiyan Part 4. Last time on the What If, the UA Sports Festival happened, with Izuku learning how to fly before the actual festival. And during the 1v1s, Izuku lost to Todoroki, but not before his hair started to flicker on and off yellow. And afterward, the hero internships happened, with Izuku and Ochako going to the pro hero Gunhead. And Ida was just recently announced dead, and he was presumably killed by the hero killer. Okay, so now that's out of the way, let's jump into the video in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we begin this what if the day it was announced that Ida was killed, and when Izuku and Ochako got the news about Ida's death. And when they learned about it, they were upset, and they felt like they should have done more. And after grieving for a couple of hours, the two go back to training, since they want to make sure this never happens again, so they want to get stronger. So now we skip a couple of weeks, so now it's time for the final exams. And by this point, Izuku has gotten even better with controlling his new form, with him now having a time limit of a minute before he has to revert back to normal, and wait half an hour before he can use that form again. So now it's time for the final exams, and the scores everyone got for the written exams will be the same as in the canon, for both the practice and the actual exam. So now it's time for the students versus teachers test, more specifically when it was time for Izuku and Bakugo's match against All Might. And when it began, Izuku took off his weights, and when he took them off, he began to run through the fake city to try to get to the exit as fast as he could. But when he was halfway through, Izuku was hit with a shockwave that All Might fired, which was strong enough to break the buildings, road, and ground around Izuku. And because Izuku ran into the blast, he was hit head on, and he got flung all the way back to the entrance of the fake city. And when Izuku got up, Bakugo was already at All Might, and he was beginning to fight him, with Bakugo using his explosions to try to avoid some of All Might's attacks. But after a couple of explosions, All Might was able to grab Bakugo by his leg, and he slammed Bakugo to the ground. And seeing this, Izuku ran towards the two, and while he was running, he was shooting out ki blasts to hopefully injure All Might, but they only did a small amount of damage. And when Izuku got to All Might, Izuku tried to punch him in the face, but when he landed the hit, All Might tanked it, and he then grabbed Izuku by the arm that punched him, and he began to swing him around. And after a couple of swings, All Might launched Izuku into a building. And when Izuku made contact with the building, he broke through the glass window, and he crashed into some furniture. And when Izuku got up, he wiped off some of the dirt and glass that was on him. And when he was done, he jumped out of the already broken window. And when he landed, Bakugo was back to fighting All Might again since he was able to regain consciousness. And when Izuku saw this, he began to gather ki into his hand. And while he was doing this, he began to go into the Super Saiyan form. And when he was ready, he told Bakugo to get out of the way. And when Bakugo heard this, he turned his head. And when he saw Izuku's Kamehameha, he fired an explosion towards the ground, which flung him into the air. And when Izuku saw Bakugo fire the explosion, Izuku fired the blast directly at All Might, which hit him in the chest and it flung him through a building a couple of feet away. And while All Might was being flung, Izuku grabbed Bakugo by his wrist, and he brought him into a nearby alleyway. And when All Might was done being flung, he began to run around to try to find the two. And after around 5 minutes, the two were able to come up with a plan. So Bakugo then gave Izuku one of his gauntlets, and they waited in separate alleyways. And eventually All Might came running past their alleyways trying to find them. And seeing this, the two jumped out of their alleyways. So Izuku was in front of All Might, and Bakugo was behind him. And when they got his attention, they both pulled the pin on their gauntlets, which surrounded All Might in a giant explosion. And when the explosion was fired, All Might was dazed. And with him like that, Izuku and Bakugo began to run toward the exit. But before they were able to get to the exit, All Might was able to get his senses back. And when he did, he began to run at the two as fast as he could. And after a couple of seconds, he was able to get to the side of Izuku. And when he did, he hit the air right next to him, which fired a shockwave at Izuku, which was strong enough to make him go flying into another building a couple of stories up. Then All Might grabbed Bakugo by his leg, and he flung him into the same building he put Izuku in. And when he landed, Bakugo saw Izuku on the ground in pain. And when Izuku got up, the two tried to think of a plan. But saying that they didn't have that much time before All Might would just come for them, the two jumped out of the already broken window. And when they landed, All Might was waiting for them. So Izuku then ran at All Might, and he began to fight him. And while Izuku was keeping All Might distracted, he shouted for Bakugo to run, which at first Bakugo was hesitant to, but he changed his mind when Izuku shouted for him to run again. And while Bakugo was running, Izuku was fighting All Might, using what he learned from the pro hero Gunhead. And after a minute, Bakugo was close to the finish line. And seeing this, All Might was about to run to Bakugo to stop him. But before he could move, Izuku went into Super Saiyan, and he hit All Might in the side as hard as he could, this time launching him into a nearby building. And where Izuku hit was where All Might had his scar, making it so All Might's timer was cut shorter, and he became weakened. And after All Might got up, he ran to the exit as fast as he could. But because of him being weakened and his weights, he wasn't able to make it in time to catch up to Bakugo. And when Bakugo escaped, an alarm rang throughout the entire fake city, announcing that Izuku and Bakugo have passed the exam. So now we skip to the next day, and Class 1A was told that even if they failed the exam, they will still be going to the summer camp. And when class was done, Class 1A decided to go shopping together for the gear for camp. And a couple minutes after getting to the mall, Izuku was all by himself, since everyone else wanted to split up to buy the things that they wanted. And before he was able to make it to an actual store, someone in a hoodie put their arm around Izuku, and he told him that it's been a while since he's last seen him, since the last time they saw each other was at the USJ. And hearing this, Izuku began to recognize the man. It was the guy with the hand mask. And seeing this, Izuku began to move to put the guy into a headlock. But seeing Izuku begin to move, Shigaraki warned him that he had the portal villain on standby, and that if he made a move, his friend would warp an entire army of Nomus into the mall. And he then asks Izuku how many people would have to die because of him. And because Izuku doesn't know if it's a bluff or not, he goes along with it. So he puts his arms down. And seeing this, Shigaraki led Izuku to a bench and they began to talk. And when they were done talking, Shigaraki came to the conclusion that All Might was at the center of all of his problems. And when he figured this out, he began to thank Izuku. But before he was done, Ochako showed up. And seeing this, Shigaraki said his final thank you. Then he walked into the crowd of civilians. And after a couple of seconds, Shigaraki was lost in the crowd. So now we skip a couple of hours and the mall has been shut down. And Izuku was taken to the police department for questioning. So now we skip to when it's time for the camp. And Class 1A just stopped at a mountain. And when they got out of the bus, they see the WWPC, who then welcomed them to the camp. Then Pixie Bop pointed in the direction of the camp, and before they could question why she was pointing to the camp, Pixie Bop began to manipulate the ground around them, and eventually she flung all of Class 1A off the cliff. And when they landed, they were told to get to the camp as fast as they could. And when they were told that, they began to walk to the campgrounds. But after a couple of seconds, monsters made out of rocks appeared, and they began to attack them. So now we skip to when the sun was setting, and Class 1A just got to the campgrounds. And because they had to deal with the monsters all the way from the cliff to the camp, they were all tired and dirty, Izuku included. So now we skip to the next morning, and everything that happened with Koda still happens. So Izuku knows about Koda's parents. And when it was around 8 AM the next day, Class 1A began to train, with Izuku spending around half the day practicing his ki control by shooting out ki blasts as powerful as he can make them in a short period of time, so he can practice firing them quickly and powerfully. And Izuku would fly around the camp by being timed, so he could increase his flying time and speed. Then the rest of the day was spent with Izuku fighting Tiger with only his fist and the Super Saiyan form, so he could get better at fighting and controlling his new form. And when they were done training, Class 1A and Class 1B had dinner. And while Izuku was having dinner, he knows that Koda wasn't there. So he got a plate of food and began to fly around, searching for Koda. And after a couple of minutes, Izuku found Koda on a cliff looking at the stars. And when Izuku got close enough, he flew back to the ground slow enough so he didn't drop the food. And when he landed, the two began to talk. Was Koda asking why did Izuku want to be a hero so much? And eventually, Koda just tells him that he's throwing his life away. And after a couple of minutes of talking, Izuku put down the plate of food and he flew back to camp. So now we skip to the next day, and by the end of the day's training, Izuku has increased his speed for flight and the duration, so he can go for half an hour at 35 miles per hour. And he also increased his time limit for Super Saiyan, so he can now handle it for 15 minutes before he feels completely drained. And when the day's training was done, the WWPC decided to have a test of courage, with all of the groups being the exact same as in the canon, so Izuku is alone. But before he could go in, he and the other people outside the forest could see that the forest was covered in blue flames. Then the two villains started to walk out of the forest, and they began to fight Pixie Bob, Mandalay, and Tiger, while the students started to run to find a place to hide. But before Izuku could do anything, he remembered that Koda was probably on the cliff, so he told Mandalay where he was going, and hearing this, she gives him a small nod. And seeing this, Izuku raised into the air and he began to fly to the cliff as fast as he could. And when he got to the cliff, he saw Koda face to face with a villain, and the villain was walking closer and closer to Koda. And seeing this, Izuku began to dive towards the two, and while Izuku was diving, he was shooting ki blasts at the villain, which hit the villain in the chest multiple times. And when the villain got hit, they backed away from Koda. And when he backed up, Izuku landed in the area between the villain and Koda. And when he landed, he told Koda to run while he can. But before Koda could do anything, the villain began to walk towards the two. And while he was walking, he told Izuku that he was on the list, and he asked him if he knew a person by the name of Bakugo, and where he was. But before Izuku could do anything, Muscular ran at Izuku, and he was able to punch him in the gut, launching him into the mountain, making a crater. And when Izuku was in the crater, Muscular began to walk towards Koda again. But before he got close enough to do anything to Koda, Izuku jumped out from the crater, and he punched Muscular in the face as hard as he could. But when his face made impact, nothing happened. And when Izuku's fist made contact, Muscular increased the size of his muscles, and he hit Izuku again, launching him towards Koda. But this time, Izuku was able to land on his feet. And seeing that his last attack did nothing, Izuku quickly unstrapped his arm and leg weights, and he ran towards Muscular again, and he tried to fight him. And it was basically bronze against speed, since no matter how hard Izuku tried to hit Muscular, nothing happened. And Izuku was fast enough to avoid most of Muscular's attacks, but after a couple minutes, Muscular was able to grab Izuku by the ankle, and he slammed him into the ground. And when Izuku landed, Muscular held Izuku down by his neck, and he began to suffocate him. But before Izuku could run out of air, Izuku was able to transform, and with his sudden boost of power, he was able to kick Muscular off of him, launching him a couple of feet away. Then when Izuku got back up, he ran at Muscular as fast as he could. and the two began to fight again, with Izuku still not as strong as Muscular, with him being a tiny bit stronger. And after a couple of minutes, Muscular flung Izuku towards Koda again, and when he landed, Muscular stopped playing around, so he put his quirk into overdrive, and once he got to maximum power, Muscular ran at Izuku and he went for a punch, and in response, Izuku stood his ground and he went for a punch, making the two attacks collide, and seeing that Muscular was way stronger than him, he was able to tell that he would lose the clash, so he began to think of a way out, but no matter how hard he tried to think, he couldn't think of anything that would allow both him and Koda to escape. So after a couple of seconds, he shouts for Koda to run while he keeps Muscular back. But before Koda could move, Muscular was able to overpower Izuku, and he pushed Izuku to the ground and he began to get crushed. And seeing this at the end, Izuku tried to use all of his energy, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't push him off. And after a couple of seconds, Izuku began to lose consciousness. But before he could get completely crushed, Koda shot out water at Muscular, and he shouted to let him go, which made Muscular get distracted for a couple of seconds. And using this to Izuku's advantage, Izuku began to lift up Muscular, slowly getting up. And while Izuku was getting up, he was giving into his rage and adrenaline, so flashes of electricity began to surround Izuku, and his hair turned yellow again. And using this new power, Izuku punched as hard as he could, launching Muscular into the mountainside. And before Muscular was able to get up, Izuku began to channel ki into his palms. And before Muscular was able to get out of the way, Izuku shot out a powered-up Kamehameha, which made a giant hole in the mountain going through it completely, eventually disappearing when the beam was hundreds of feet away. And when the smoke and dirt was settled, they were able to see Muscular on the ground, right in front of the giant hole Izuku made, and he was both burned and knocked unconscious. And shortly after Izuku saw that, Izuku's hair returned back to normal, and he began to yell from pain. And after Izuku was able to rest for a bit, he was able to inspect his injuries, which was he had blood coming from his head and limbs, and he had cuts across his entire body. And when Izuku was ready, he put Koda on his back and he began to run back to the camp. And on his way to the camp, he came across Aizawa, who when he saw Izuku told him to give Mandalay a message. And after Izuku gave Koda to Aizawa, Izuku ran to the camp as fast as he could. And when he got back to the camp, Mandalay and Tiger were still fighting the villains, so Izuku shot out a ki blast at the villain Mandalay was fighting, which was Spinner, which hit him in the chest, and then flung him into a nearby tree. And while Spinner was trying to get up, Izuku ran to Mandalay, and he told her the message that Aizawa gave him. And when he was done giving the message, Mandalay sent out the message to all the students, which was Aizawa gave them permission to fight. And after Mandalay sent out the message, Izuku ran into the woods to find Bakugo, and after a couple minutes, Izuku got pushed to the ground, and when he looked at what was on top of him, he saw Shoji, who was all bloody. And when he saw Shoji, he asked him what happened to him, and in response, Shoji pointed to a nearby tree, and when he did, Izuku looked at it, and when he did, he saw that it was a normal tree, and he was about to ask him what he was pointing at, but before he could finish his sentence, a giant dark hand slashes at it, cutting the tree in half. Shoji then explained that Tokoyami lost control over Dark Shadow, and seeing this, Izuku and Shoji began to run, trying to figure out a plan while still avoiding Dark Shadow's attacks. And after a couple of minutes, Izuku was able to come up with a plan, so he and Shoji began to look for Bakugo and Todoroki, and while they were running, they were using Shoji's limbs as bait to keep Dark Shadow following them. And after a couple minutes of running, they were able to find Todoroki and Bakugo, who were fighting the villain Moonfish. And when they got there, Shoji and Izuku jumped over Moonfish, and before he was able to get out of the way, Dark Shadow ran into him, and he slammed him into a tree, which when Moonfish made contact, he got knocked out. Then Izuku told Bakugo and Todoroki to fire their flames at Tokoyami, and after a couple minutes, the two were able to weaken Dark Shadow enough so Tokoyami was able to gain control again. And after they were done with that, the group began to think of a plan to get back to the camp. And after a couple minutes, they decided to have Tokoyami and Bakugo in the back, while the other three were in front of them, so Bakugo wouldn't be alone. And after a couple minutes of walking, the group comes across Sue stuck to a tree, and Ochako on the ground getting her blood drained by a villain. And seeing the group, the villain got off of Ochako, and she ran deeper into the forest. And when the group got the two to their feet, they told them they were bringing Bakugo back to camp. But when they told them this, the two pointed out that Bakugo wasn't behind them, and when the three turn around, they see that Bakugo and Tokoyami weren't behind them. And seeing this, the group began to look around, and after a couple minutes, when Izuku looked up and paid attention, he realized that there was someone standing on a tree above them. And when the person realized that they saw him, he introduced himself as Mr. Compress, and when he was done with the introduction, he showed two marbles in his hand. And seeing this, Todoroki shot out a wave of flames at the villain, which he was able to easily avoid. Then the villain began to escape by jumping away on the top of the trees. And seeing this, Izuku rose to the sky, and he began to fly at the villain. But since he was tired and beaten, he wasn't able to go as fast as he wanted. But after a minute, Izuku was able to go fast enough to catch up, and he tackled Mr. Compress and the two fell to the ground. And when Izuku looked up, he realized that he was at the villain's rendezvous point, so there was a giant portal and a couple of villains right in front of him. But before he could do anything, Mr. Compress threw the marbles he had, and he turned himself into a marble. Then when he was a couple of feet away, he turned himself back to normal. Then Izuku began to fight the villains, which he was able to stand some ground because of his strength and ki. But after a couple minutes, Izuku got too slow. Slow enough so Dabi was able to hit Izuku in the right arm and leg with a blue flame attack. And once Izuku got burned, Izuku was slowed even more. And when Izuku was slowed down, the League of Villains left through the portal, taking both Bakugo and Tokoyami. And shortly after the villains left, Izuku finally passed out from exhaustion and pain. And hours later, ambulances arrived to take the injured people to the hospital, and the cops arrived to take the beaten villains to jail. And that's where I'm going to leave the What If. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you next time on Something Z.